Howdy, this is the Amateur Logician. This video will introduce some modal logic. We'll be bridging traditional logic, at least a little bit, including the Octagon of Opposition with contemporary symbolic logic. We'll talk about 8 traditional modal propositions, and we'll even get into some philosophy of logic and metaphysics. What grounds contingency, logically speaking? What grounds possibility? The idea of possible worlds, and the traditional alternative of potentiality and actuality will be considered. Now, basically what a modal proposition does is to specify the manner or mode of how the predicate is linked up with the subject. Consider expressions like must be versus might be, or consider can be versus cannot be. In other words, we're thinking in terms of necessity, impossibility, or possibility. Let's look at a couple of examples that are presently on the Octagon of Opposition. Consider the proposition that I've symbolized as IN versus the one I've symbolized as IP. So IN has it that some men are necessarily mortal, whereas IP has it that some men are possibly mortal. The only difference between these two propositions deals with modality. One has necessity, the other one has possibility. But this raises the question, how can we determine if a modal proposition is true or false? Now, one great construction is possible worlds. And I think that helps a lot in helping us decide, is this modal proposition true or is it false? But first, note that there's a difference between what's logically possible and what's nomonologically possible. What's logically possible doesn't entail any contradiction. So no contradictions. That's a very, very minimal standard. Consider the proposition all men are mortal and non-mortal. Well, that's not logically possible. That's a straight-out contradiction. Or take the proposition some men can run faster than the speed of light. Well, okay, that's not possible, but there's no inherent contradiction in that proposition. It's hence logically possible, but it is not nomonologically possible. What's nomonologically possible is what's possible according to the laws of nature. So think about the laws of nature. No man can run faster than the speed of light. Now, what's nomonologically possible is a proper subset of what's logically possible. What's logically possible is wide-ranging, whereas what's nomonologically possible is much more narrow. Now, what is a possible world? It's a great way to think about modal propositions and to help answer the question, is this modal proposition true or false? And this traces back to the logician and philosopher David Lewis. Now, possible worlds just deal with ways the world could be. So we have ways the world could be. We live in one possible world, namely this one, and there are infinitely many other ones that are different vis-a-vis this one in various ways. There's a possible world in which no human beings exist. There's a possible world in which no planets exist. There's a possible world in which the gravitational constant is different. However, there are some things that have to be true in all possible worlds. Those are necessary truths. Now, in modal logic, there are 2 important symbols. We have this diamond P and this square P. The diamond stands for possible, and the square stands for necessary. So this proposition here, P is possibly the case, is true if and only if P is true in a possible world, at least one. Whereas this necessary P is true if and only if P is true in all possible worlds. It cannot be otherwise. For example, the laws of mathematics are true in all possible worlds. They're necessary truths. For example, a triangle has 3 sides. That's going to be true in all possible worlds. But to take an example from the Thomist philosopher Michael Gorman, there's a possible world in which there are no triangles that are green. The laws of logic are necessary truths. Ergo, they're true in all possible worlds. Water is H2O. That's going to be true in all possible worlds. However, there may be possible worlds in which water does not exist. And if we're thinking about infinitely many possible worlds, because the existence of water is not necessary, there's a possible world in which water does not exist. So this is a good baseline to determine if a modal proposition is true or false. And we're going to get more into the philosophy a little bit later, but let's consider modal propositions a little bit more in depth. So when it comes to traditional logic, we can consider modal propositions as a species of categorical propositions. Recall that categorical propositions declare something to be or not to be the case. Take the tried and true example, all men are mortal. Now, any good categorical proposition has two features, quantity and quality. And my apologies if you are hearing my stomach in the background. Maybe I should not have recorded this after eating, but be that as it may, I'm going to continue. So quantity is either universal or particular. Quality is either affirmative or negative. And if you have studied some traditional logic, you know that we symbolize the four types of categorical propositions as A, I, E, and O. An A type of proposition is a universal affirmative, all men are mortal. I is a particular affirmative, some men are mortal. E is a universal negative, no men are mortal. And O is a particular negative, some men are not mortal. Now, modal propositions, at least traditional modal propositions, are a species of categorical propositions, but they do more than just assert or deny a predicate of a subject. Again, modal propositions contain the manner or mode in which the subject is predicated. So what's new is modality. Again, we're thinking about necessity, contingency, impossibility, or possibility. Let's think about these in turn. So with necessity, we can think of this as must-be propositions. Or in other words, is necessarily, has to be, cannot be not. In all possible worlds, a necessary truth is true in all of them. Contingency, need not be. A contingent truth is not true in all possible worlds. There's a possible world in which it is not true. In other words, it's not necessarily, does not have to be, can be not. We have impossibility, cannot be. In other words, is not possibly, is not able to be, must be not. And finally, possibility, can be. In other words, is possibly, is able to be, need not be. Now, since there are four standard categorical propositions and we're just adding modality, we're just multiplying by 2, so we have 8 traditional modal propositions. Now, when it comes to symbolizing them, what I've done is as follows. The first letter is the type of categorical proposition, A, I, E, or O. The next letter stands for the modality, necessity, impossibility, possibility. So AN is a universal affirmative necessity. All S are necessarily P. For example, all men are necessarily mortal. EI is a universal negative impossibility. No S can be P. For example, no men can be mortal. IN is a particular affirmative necessity. Some S are necessarily P. For example, some men are necessarily mortal. II is a particular affirmative impossibility. It's impossible that some S are P. For example, it's impossible that some men are mortal. AP is a universal affirmative possibility. It's possible that all S are P. For example, it's possible that all men are mortal. IP is a particular affirmative possibility. Some S are possibly P. For example, some men are possibly mortal. OP is a particular negative possibility. It's possible that some S can be P. And EP is a universal negative possibility. It's possible that no S can be P. So here we have our 8 traditional modal propositions. And amazingly enough, and cool enough, we can relate them on the Octagon of Opposition, which is very much analogous to the square of opposition with categorical propositions. So if you think about categorical propositions, you have, again, A, I, E, and O. You have the square of opposition. And one of the most important features deals with contradictive relations. So A and O are contradictive. If we think about all men are mortal as an A proposition and some men are not mortal as an O proposition, both cannot be true simultaneously. If one is true, the other one must be false. If one is false, the other one must be true. And the same thing holds with modal propositions. So if we're thinking about contradictive opposition, we're thinking about first in terms of the categorical nature of the proposition and then the modality. So with categorical propositions, A and O contradict each other, E and I contradict each other. With modality, possibility, necessity. So take, for example, IN and EP. We have some men are necessarily mortal, and then we have no men are possibly mortal. On the one hand, they differ in regards to their categorical nature. They contradict each other. We have the I versus the E. We have the necessity. We have the possibility. If one is true, the other one is false. If one is false, the other one is true. We can just appeal to our logical intuition. If some men are necessarily mortal, if that is true, there's no way that it can be true that no men are possibly mortal. Likewise, if we thought of AP versus II, or IP versus EI, and so forth. You have those contradictive relations. But you also have other types of relations. For example, subaltern. Consider AN and IP. Here we have all men are necessarily mortal versus some men are possibly mortal. Now, in traditional modal logic and in some modal logic systems in contemporary logic, necessity implies possibility, and that makes intuitive sense. If something is necessarily the case, then it's possibly the case. Similarly, impossibility implies not possible. Now, in contemporary modal logic, C.I. Lewis labeled different strengths of modal logic. And the logical intuition that necessity implies possibility is found in modal logic system S3. And that parallels, so to speak, the scholastic intuition. So, because of that, again, if all men are necessarily mortal is true, if that is true, let's just take it as true, then it must be true that some men are possibly mortal. We can also think about modal negation via the square of opposition. Now, this is much more of a simplified opposition form. We have, it is necessarily true that for all x, x is an f. It's possibly true or the case that for all x, x is an f. It's necessarily the case that it is not the case that all x is an f. It's possibly the case that is not the case that for all x, x is an f. We have a square of opposition, such that we can say that, for example, these two propositions contradict each other. But knowing that, we can derive some logical equivalencies. In other words, we can say that not necessary for all x, x is an f, that is logically equivalent to possibly it is not the case that for all x, x is an f. Because if we're going to deny this, we know that it thereby follows that this proposition must be true. And therefore, this left-hand side and this right-hand side must be logically equivalent. That is, it is not necessary that all of x is a f, implies that it is possible that not all of x is an f, and vice versa. Likewise, if we deny that it is possible that for all x, x is an f, that's going to be logically equivalent to it is necessary that it is not the case that for all x, x is an f. So we know that this proposition here is contradicted to this proposition up here. So if we deny this bottom hand left-hand side, we can affirm this upper right-hand side. And so therefore, this left-hand side and this right-hand side must be logically equivalent. That is, it is not possible that all of x is an f implies that it is necessary that is not the case that all of x is an f, and vice versa. In other words, it is not possible implies impossibility. All of this you can find in traditional scholastic logic, although not with these symbols necessarily. But the power of modal logic in traditional logic is there, but many people don't realize it. It's not just seen in modern contemporary symbolic logic. We can derive logical equivalencies. We can see various types of opposition. We can derive contradictive propositions, and so forth. And we can make inferences, by the way. So if you pick up a book, probably a used book to be honest, you will find this Octagon of Opposition and an analysis of it in a traditional logic book. And to my mind, it's a very beautiful illustration of modal propositions. It's a really cool diagram. And for us visual learners, it helps a lot. It helps me because I'm very much a visual learner. And I'm a slow learner in many ways, and I need these visuals. It helps. Just like when I think about the logical equivalencies, I like to draw out that square of opposition. Let's consider this from the point of view of philosophy. Let's go into this a little bit more in depth and think about what's underneath the surface. Because on the one hand, yes, possible worlds is a great way to interpret modal logic. I don't deny that. It's a great construct. However, if you're taking this too literally, like David Lewis, it seems to run into problems. Because according to some philosophers, in particular David Lewis, possible worlds are not mere intellectual constructs, but realities. In fact, for Lewis, all possible worlds really exist, but we don't have access to them. We only have access to our possible world, but there are infinitely many others out there, and they really are out there. They have physical existence for David Lewis. However, in contrast, Plantinga, who's still around and alive, he's a great philosopher and theologian, he takes a different view. For Plantinga, possible worlds are real, but in a quasi-Platonic form. But only one has real physical concrete existence, namely ours. Now, there are several problems with David Lewis's view of possible worlds. And the way to start this is to think about the question, what about individuals in possible worlds? Can individuals exist in different possible worlds? Now, for Lewis, we are world bounded. I only exist in this possible world. You only exist in this possible world. We cannot be simultaneously in multiple possible worlds at once. Remember, for Lewis, all possible worlds really do physically exist. In contrast, it's much easier to answer this question if we're thinking about Plantinga's view of possible worlds. It makes sense to talk of you or me in different possible worlds. After all, those different possible worlds don't have concrete physical existence. But consider a proposition like this. George, while not having a beard, could have a beard. And in this, I'm very much following the great Thomist philosopher Michael Gorman in his book on Thomistic metaphysics. How do we make sense of that proposition? George, while not having a beard, could have a beard. Well, there's a possible world where George has a beard, right? But how does it make sense in David Lewis's worldview? After all, individual George doesn't exist in different possible worlds. I am world bounded, right? Now, Lewis can reply with what is called the Counterpart Theory. So apparently I had to explain this to my iPhone as well because it just went, So this world has George in it. In another world, there is no George, but it has a counterpart that's close to being George. But that doesn't seem like a fitting solution because it's not George. It's just similar to George. What if you're thinking about a possible world in which no human beings exist? Is there something that looks close to George even in that? But there's also the Humphrey Objection. And The objection is as follows. So he lost to Richard Nixon when it comes to becoming the President of the United States. Yet he could have won. Herbert Humphrey could have beat Nixon. He could have won. With Lewis, how can we make sense of that? All we can say is that his counterpart could have won, not that he himself could have won. So for these reasons, Lewis's view of possible worlds does not seem correct. But in fact, we don't even have to take possible worlds as literal entities, not even in the Plantinga sense. And this brings us to Michael Gorman. We don't need possible worlds. And he asks us the question, why is it possible for a window to break? Rather than bring up possible worlds to explain this, we can understand that there is a passive potency in the window itself. There's a disposition, there's a tendency to break. It's fragile. It has the potential to break. Moreover, there are other things out there in the world that have active potency such that they can actually break that window. So for each thing that is possible, there's some actual thing. And this brings the distinction between act or actuality and potency or potentiality, where potentiality or potency is always linked to actuality. Actuality is the foundation for all potentiality. So for each thing that is possible, there's some actual thing. And then we can scale things up, so to speak, to think about the totality of possibilities out there in the entire universe. So we ground possibility not in possible worlds, but in this act versus potency distinction. Similarly, another philosopher, which we've talked about on this YouTube channel before, namely Edward Feser, he's talked about how traditional logic subtleties cannot be captured by possible world analysis. So in analytical philosophy, we often define something in terms of the features it has in all possible worlds, like a triangle or whatnot. But this has things backwards, Feser argues. We need to know the essence first before we can get into the property. And I'll explain this in a second. So we have essence versus property. And in a traditional logic book, you will see this distinction. For example, Socrates has the ability to learn languages, but that ability, in fact, is just a property, not an essential feature of him. Socrates, being a rational animal, is his essence. That property is derived from the essence. It follows from his essence. But this distinction between property and essence is lost in possible world analysis because the moment you take out Socrates from a possible world, both the property and the essence are lost, and so possible worlds blurs this important logical distinction. And that's another issue, which we can get into even more in depth, but that is an issue. So the subtleties, the good distinctions of metaphysics, traditional metaphysics, and traditional logic are lost in possible world analysis, it seems. So again, the alternative is that possibility is not grounded in possible worlds, rather it's grounded in actual things that can change and have causal powers. While I think possible worlds is a really cool intellectual construction or construct, a good model, it's not metaphysically, so to speak, true. If we want to think about possibility and contingency, we have to resort back to traditional metaphysics and think about actuality and potentiality. But it is a really good way, nonetheless, to construct a kind of a metaphorical understanding of modal propositions. Now, this has been a fairly wide-ranging video, perhaps too much so, but there is a lot more to cover when it comes to modal logic, though we haven't gone into inference or we haven't gone into depth when it comes to the different types of modal logics out there in symbolic logic and so forth, but this will have to do for now. But I really wanted to show you all the power of modal logic, and in particular, the power of traditional logic, even when it comes to modal propositions. And One of the coolest things in traditional logic, I think, is the square of opposition, but also the octagon of opposition. If you enjoyed this video in any way, please consider giving this video a like. I would appreciate it. Feel free to leave a comment below. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel. Visit my website at amateurlogician.com. I have an extensive tutorial on traditional verbal style logic. I have many book recommendations if you want to study traditional logic, but even some book recommendations when it comes to propositional logic and predicate logic, symbolic logic, that is. But thank you so much for watching. Good luck to you and be well.